Joshua is the last of God's elected leaders. Now we're going to go through about 350 years, 350 to 400 years of no leadership. Israel gets completely out of control. God has to come up with some new people. So, welcome to Judges. 13 judges. Not behind a bench judge, but a deliverer. 12 men and one named Deborah. A civilization generally lasts about 200 years and goes from bondage to spiritual faith to courage, to liberty, to abundance, to leisure, to complacency, to apathy, to dependence, to weakness, to bondage. Nobody pays any attention to this cycle. They just keep doing it. Every man does what is right in his own eyes. They still allow enemies to populate their cities. No strong successor since Joshua. Israel asks God who should be their new leader. Every city-state has its own ruler, like a mayor, thanks to the Levitical tribe, and the cities of refuge, but none overall. The Lord said, Judah shall be the first to fight. Chapter 1, Judah starts getting busy with his fighting. Judah fought in Hebron. Caleb says, he who attacks Sephron can have my daughter as wife. Othniel wins the prize. That's how they did it culturally back then. The dowry was given to the father of the bride, sheep and camels. It was protection. Women had no rights back then and could get kicked out by hubby just because. It was alimony in advance. Lots of conquering at the time. Chapter 2, an angel of the Lord shows up, and when the writing is like this, it is generally God himself showing up. Joshua finally dies. This leads to one big problem for the Israelites. No leadership. Each one left to his own. No God. Come on, guys. They chose to serve the Baals, which were the gods of sacrificing children. Chapter 3, time for a judge on the scene. Remember, these people were just short-term leaders and not anything to do with judging. First up, God gave them Othniel, judge number 1. He lasted 40 years. Next, Ehud. Some say he was in his right mind. He took out Eglon, who was extremely fat and didn't care. Not much was said about Ehud after that. My guess is he just went back home. After Ehud came Shamgar, judge number 3. Nothing was said about Shamgar. My guess is he's not going to do it. Next is judge number 4, Deborah. She was cool. Led the people under a palm tree. This girl was tough, and she should be read about. She calls on Barak. Barak was sent to battle by Deborah, 10,000 soldiers worth. It began to rain, and their chariots were getting stuck in the mud. She is a prophetess for the Lord. The first one was Miriam, then Deborah, then Huda, then Anna. Deborah was a scrapper. Then, of course, you need to read about it. You need to read about Jael. The king wanted cold water because it was very hot outside, and he thought she was being hospitable. She gave him milk. Milk has tryptophan. He fell asleep. She then sent a tent peg into his temple. This girl used milk, which has tryptophan in it, to knock this guy out and put him out of our misery. You need to read about this one. Chapter 5, Deborah writes a song about what went on. You need to read it, the whole chapter. The Bible has nothing more to say about Deborah, so I don't know what happened to her. The Israelites still have not learned their lesson and went back to worshiping the worship of Baal and Asherah. God gave them to the Midianites for 6 years, 6 more years. Chapter 6, the Israelites are so oppressed by the Midianites that they head for the mountains. They were so oppressed that the Midianites camp around the fields of the Israelites. And when the crops were ready for harvest, the Midianites stripped them. They were so oppressed, they called out to God, and he sent them a prophet. This prophet comes and reminds them of their past. He then stops under an oak tree where he meets Gideon. He tells Gideon he will be a great warrior. Gideon is now number 6 judge. He told Gideon he would wipe them out, the Midianites. God was stunned so much that he asked the angel, actually God, to perform miracles not once or twice, but 3 times. You see, Gideon didn't think too much of himself, and this was something he wanted to be absolutely sure of because of his lack of faith in God. By the way, the Gideon Bible has nothing to do with Gideon, but instead was a group that wanted to give out Bibles to motels and such, that they decided they needed a name for their group and chose the name of Gideon because God chose Gideon for a task, and these Gideons decided to call themselves such. The story of Gideon is one you definitely need to read. By the way, any verse in the Bible that has the Lord in all caps, it is likely God himself. They call it a theophany. Basically, God incarnate. Yes, both God and Jesus have been to the earth before Jesus took on an earthly body. Gideon immediately went to work. First off, cutting down the Asher pole and the symbols of Baal. When the people wanted to know who did it and found it was Gideon, Joash, his dad, stepped in and said Baal needed to be able to defend himself. Therefore, the people decided to start calling Gideon Jerubbaal because he tried to fight with Baal. Now, God readies Gideon to take on Midianites by having him reduce the size of his army before he fights the Midianites, because God doesn't want Gideon to get a big head and to think he didn't need God's help. God reduces Gideon's army to 300 from 13,000. Gideon's army was reduced to a few good men. So the Lord will get the praise for the battle, because Gideon will get a big head and think he did it by himself. Next, we will take on the chapter 7 and Gideon continued battles. Check out Judges 002.